Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again, and as of this video, if you're still following my reading project and if you're still reading alongside me Gravity's Rainbow, if you're still following the schedule, we've officially reached the half of the novel, so let's give ourselves a pat on the back. And so far I have to say it's going so much more smoothly than I expected. I expected to regret the whole idea of the project halfway through. Instead, I'm loving it, especially because I loved this last section we read, which constituted the first 100 pages of part 3 in the zone or so. I loved it so much. I especially adored the first section, the first dozen or 20 pages, where Slothrop finally starts his quest for the Esgeret and crosses this post-World War II Germany, this lawless zone, posing as a journalist. And this lawless zone, despite what the title may suggest, is not really some kind of wasteland where only the strongest survive. Instead, it is a place of endless possibilities, just like those anarchists in Switzerland supposed it would be. Even though, let's be clear about it, Pynchon is very good at pointing and at making the reader aware of the situation in Germany, of the fact that the victorious armies, the Allies, the Soviet Union, are exploiting this defeated nation. It points time and again at the suffering of the German people, but at the same time, in a way that I personally do not find offensive or ahistorical at all, this zone is still a sort of dreamland, is still represented as a sort of wonderland where everything may happen. In this sense, I perceive a big difference between this section, at least so far, I'm talking about part 3, and part 1, Beyond Zero, set in largely in London during the last months of the war, with V1 and V2s falling all over the place. Both of these parts are made of sketches and jump between different characters all the time, and they alternate very different narrative styles. More about that in a second. But whereas part 1 felt very grim to me and discussed at length the suffering of these people of London during the war, the way the war changed quintessentially the life of people, even their everyday lives, the way they went about their romantic relationships. See, for instance, Jessica and Roger, or Slothrop and his women. It felt very different to me from the more liberating way the post-World War II Germany is described in part 3. The suffering is there, it is still described, it is not covered up, but there's this sense of endless possibilities and that everything may happen from here. I perceive a much stronger sense of joyousness from this part, but by all means let me know what you think. Also because, as you may have noticed, I'm not entirely able to put this into words, because I could definitely point at some epi passages from part 1 and at some rather grim passages from part 3, not last among them Slothrop's exploration of the missile bases of that underground complex. But still, let me know, as always, as with all of these videos, let me know about your experience. Because one thing I'm noticing is that most of us are having slightly different experiences, considering how cryptic, how complex Gravity's Rainbow is, how many characters there are in here, how many difficult passages. It's totally expectable that each of us is getting something different out of the novel. And for instance, one thing I noticed is that I had some difficulties with part 2, Au pair, Mokasin Neuermann Göring, whereas several of you guys, most of you guys, felt that the part was rather enjoyable and they had no problem with it. And there was lots of love, absolutely lots of love for the tank scene in part 2, during the party at the casino. And one thing some of you remarked on that tank scene, on that tank exploding a room in the casino, firing on it, is that at times with that scene it wasn't 100% clear whether that was actually happening or whether it was all part of Slothrop's fantasies. Of course, a central feature of Gravity's Rainbow is that that is not that very clear in so many different different scenes, even Slothrop's women in London, the whole correlation between his boners and the way, the places where the rockets fell. It's never 100% resolved whether those corresponded to actual moments where he had sex or whether he was just fantasizing about that. And here too, in one of my very favorite passages in part 3, we have Slothrop together with this German woman, Gally. Hilarious scene. He discovers that she has a, let's call him a boyfriend in the Red Army, and he is scared that this Russian guy is going to come and kick his ass. And you read at least 2 or 3 times, you read these very brief scenes where you see the Russian guy coming and actually beating the shit out of Slothrop, and then you discover that it was just it was just Slothrop fantasizing about that, having some paranoid thoughts about that possibility. And sometimes it's difficult to perceive the difference, and sometimes you read something and you don't quite realize that what you're reading is a reverie or a character imagining stuff. And that's part of the beautiful ambiguity that pervades the entire novel, so that so many scenes you always have to be wondering about the truth value of what you're reading. And one of the key questions lots of you guys asked in comments to previous videos in this series was what exactly makes Gravity's Rainbow postmodern, because of course Gravity's Rainbow is often considered to be a key text in so-called high postmodernism, which means hardcore postmodernism, let's say, and that is a very complicated question because there's really no critical consensus on what postmodernist fiction is, but among the many features articulated and theorized by scholars such as Brian McHale or Linda Hutcheon, the idea that the novel keeps foregrounding its own fictionality by juxtaposing different narratives within the book, by always making you question the truth value of what you're reading. Is what you're reading actually happening? Is it a fantasy? Is it part of a movie? Foregrounding the fictionality of these events is one of the key strategies in postmodernist fiction. The whole point, supposedly, is to make the reader aware of the process of fiction creating, of fictionalization, so that you are aware of it, so that you become aware of it even outside the realm of literature, even when, say, you're watching the news and you start noticing that the way facts are presented, the way events are narrated, maybe follows a certain agenda, maybe wants to hammer in a certain point. Same as when you read history. Whatever historical report always comes from a perspective and a point of view, so it in a way it is supporting some ideals maybe, or it is giving preference to a certain side of history rather than another. This is truly the ABC of postmodern thought, and these are threads, are points of discussion that are very easy to pick up from any reading of Gravity's Rainbow. Even just the fact that the novel mixes so freely historical accuracy, and Pynchon is definitely committed to his work as a historical novel, and whimsy, and you know, these dream sequences and these bizarre elements and these paranormal or even supernatural occurrences. It points precisely at that idea that any historical account is going to be constructed. All historical accounts are never going to represent what happened, but are only going to give you a version of the event. And making that version particularly silly, as Gravity's Rainbow does time and again, is a good way of stressing that point, that up to a certain point, all historical accounts are going to be inevitably silly, or at least are going to be flawed. And of course, highlighting and pointing to the fictionality of historical representation, to the way fictional narratives are created. Most notably, take Slothrop, the fact that he becomes aware that his life is following a narrative that he had no idea was even there, the fact that he is being experimented upon, he was experimented upon as a child, there's a story there, his own story, that he didn't know. All of these strategies, all of these narrative strategies want you to reflect on grand narratives, on what narrative maybe is behind the story of your life that you didn't even know. And connected to this are interpretations of history, once again as grand narrative. The idea, for instance, articulated in Gravity's Rainbow, that war is not that, you know, epic conflict between different ideologies that history often portrays, but instead, the novel argues, is just a form of trade. It's just a game between powers, between economical powers, in order to generate more trade and keep the world spinning, basically, at least this oppressive system, to keep it in place. And of course, all of these are very complex topics, and in my defense, it's very difficult to do them justice in a short YouTube video, also because any of these points, I can definitely see how someone could counter them, maybe by saying that some of these conceptions of postmodernism are now have been overcome by more recent criticism, or by constructing a different reading of the novel very easily. In general, once again, there's really no critical consensus on postmodernist fiction, let alone on postmodern thought. That said, some other POMO features of Gravity's Rainbow include the way its juxtaposition of high culture and popular culture, the fact that at times it almost looks like a Hollywood movie, the novelization of a movie of that sort, but at the same time sometimes you get the poetry of Rilke referenced, or the works of Wagner. At the same time it references figures in popular culture. There's Mickey Rooney in the section we read in these last 2 weeks. Also its circular structure, both as a whole, and we'll see that later, but also in some of its sections, in some of its passages, where the passage where Katya is introduced in part 1, Beyond the Zero, that by itself is a circular sort of mini narrative within the narrative of Gravity's Rainbow. And also, of course, very basically, its nature as a sort of pastiche, as a commission of so many different styles and so many different, the presence of so many different references, and the whole messiness of the thing. And when it comes to that idea of fusing different styles, one of the beautiful but maybe often a bit frustrating things about Gravity's Rainbow is that different sections are written in very different, once again, styles, registers. Some of these are truly cryptic and truly foggy, and I'm absolutely convinced they were written under the influence of some terrible drug and never truly edited, not fully, whereas some other sections are perfectly clear and read beautifully, like the most engaging of literature, engaging and entertaining. And those first 12-20 pages in part 3 in the zone, which I talked about, you know, where Slothrop also meets Ensign and makes a mortal enemy of that other guy, Marvy, sorry. That part, those 12-20 pages are written in such a beautiful style and very engaging and very accessible. It reminded me a lot of the way Pynchon will write later in Against the Day and later novels. Definitely Pynchonian, 100% crazy and peculiar, but also more accessible. Again, had all of Gravity's Rainbow been written like that, it would have made for a very different reading experience. But as we say where I'm from, if my aunt had balls, she would be a pool table. And since I mentioned Against the Day, a question for those of you who have also read that one novel. Do you see some references to Against the Day, or at least some connections in the passage where Chicherin is in Central Asia? Because of course the reference to the Kyrgyz light, this bizarre phenomenon, made me think of the Tunguska event, actual historical event, which is referenced extensively in Against the Day. And also at one point, it's on page 427 in my edition of the novel, Vintage 2013, Chicherin talks about, the narrator goes, Chicherin will spend 12 hours then, face up on the desert, a prehistoric city greater than Babylon, lying in stifled mineral sleep a kilometer below his back. Is this a reference to Shambhala, the buried city under the sands in Against the Day? I don't know, I'm very curious because of course I like this trans-fictional novels which share a common universe. Of course, many Pynchon fans know, or at least argue, that all of Pynchon's novels happen in the same universe, and of course there are some recurring themes, some recurring images, and some recurring characters and families in his novels, and I love these connections. just as a fan. I love this stuff. It tickles my nerdy side, which constitutes like 99% of me. It's not really a side, it's like the whole thing. Anyway guys, let me know what you thought about these first 100 or so pages of part 3. I'm definitely looking forward to the rest of this part, to the next bit, and let me know what you thought about this, if you're still hooked by Gravity's Rainbow, if you're having difficulties. As mentioned, I probably encountered more difficulties with part 2, Casino Armageddon, than with this section of part 3, but we'll see. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. Also because, spoiler alert, not about the plot, but about the novel, the last bit of it, the last few hundred pages, are famously messy. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, thank you as always for watching this video. Please contribute with your reading experience in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.